Have you ever imagined that in the icy oceans of 1942, it wasn't the battleships, the old cargo vessels that held the fate of the world in their rusted hulls? That the most powerful weapons weren't guns, but sacks of flour and barrels of oil? Welcome back to a series of untold historical stories. In today's episode, we join naval historian John Poshell to uncover a forgotten chapter of World War II when the shipping industry became the lifeline of survival.
And when men without uniforms made the ultimate sacrifice. Here, cargo ships didn't just carry goods, they carried the hope of nations.
They had no statues, but they were the reason the flame of freedom never died.
Get ready. What you're about to hear is not just history, it's a story of courage, sacrifice, and those who stood against the sea arm only with belief. Part 1. 1940 to the heart of World War II, when the world drifted on a silent sea. The year 1942 was a time when certainty vanished from the world. The seas were no longer calm and blue, they became cold, watery graves. Cities were no longer places of poetry, but targets for bombs. And the shipping industry, once seen as a backstage function, suddenly stepped into the spotlight, becoming the lifeblood of war, where life and death were measured by cargo manifests and miles at sea. It was a year when the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. Air raid sirens blared over London as German bombers prowled the skies. Torpedoes tore into hulls across the Atlantic. Convoys departed from the docks of New York, carrying fuel, weapons, food, and hope, sailing into the unknown, often with no guarantee of return. In the darkness of war, maritime transport was no longer just logistics, it became a battlefield, silent and brutal. "I never thought I'd be a soldier," said James McCarthy, a British merchant sailor. "I was just transporting flour, but then someone hit my ship with a torpedo." When you're standing in the dark, deciding whether to jump into the icy ocean or burn with the engine room, you know you're in the war, even without a uniform. After the Pearl Harbor attack in late 1941, the United States entered World War II, and by 1942, every ocean had become a war zone. In Europe, Nazi Germany unleashed vast packs of U-boats, stalking Allied convoys like predators. On strategic maps, shipping lanes once mere ink lines linking continents had become lifelines, where every movement came at a price in blood. It wasn't just soldiers who mattered anymore. Cargo barrels of fuel, tons of steel, loaves of bread became weapons. Without tankers, armored divisions would stall in the deserts of North Africa. Without grain ships, British cities would starve under siege. Without troop transports and ammunition, the D-Day landings would never happen. As President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared,
"Without those ships, there will be no victory."
But those ships weren't warships. They had no heavy armor, no guns bristling from every angle. They were merchant vessels, old, slow, often patched together, and they carried ordinary men, farmers, engineers, fishermen. Men who had never dreamed of being part of a war. And they sailed, not with shields, but with courage.
"The moon was the scariest thing,"
recalled Michael Russo, an Italian captain in exile.
"The sea was calm, shining like glass, but under the moonlight, our ship glowed like a whale, belly up, and the sharks, the U-boats, they were waiting below."
In the Pacific, the Japanese expanded like a tidal wave. Islands fell, outposts were cut off, but more than bombs, they targeted shipping routes. They understood. Cut off supplies, and the Americans would starve at sea. And the United States, knowing this, answered with industry. Shipyards rose along both coasts. The legendary Liberty ships were born, simple, affordable, fast. Every 4 days, a new ship was ready to launch. These were not just machines, they were acts of belief. The belief that every crate carried the weight of freedom. That the shipping industry celebrated, and Unsung was the unseen pillar holding the world together. In Britain, citizens grew food in victory gardens. In America, women took up welding torches in ship factories. At sea, sailors kept watch beside anti-aircraft guns mounted not on battleships, but on freighters. Because they knew, in this war, everyone was a soldier. A silent war played out every night. Any strange sonar ping could freeze the blood. Every survived journey was a miracle, and every cargo that reached its destination was a triumph, but real. "I hauled up nets that didn't just have fish," said Malcolm Finley, an old fisherman off the coast of Scotland. Sometimes, there were life jackets, once, an arm still wearing a wristwatch. These stories tragic and quiet were another face of war. Not where cannons roared, but where engines hummed. Not where medals were pinned, but where ordinary people stood between the world and collapse. And perhaps, those without statues or songs were the ones who truly saved humanity from the abyss. John Pauschel, naval historian, once concluded in an interview,
"I don't know the names of everyone who died at sea that year, but I know this: without them, the world would have drowned in darkness."
Part 2. The Atlantic and the Threat from German U-boats. The Atlantic Ocean cold waters, where life and death collided. During the most brutal years of World War II, it was not just a vast body of water connecting America and Europe. It became an invisible battlefield where steel phantoms beneath the waves spread terror across every ship, every sailor, and every crate carrying hope. The threat was named U-boat, the German Nazi submarines that turned the sea into a graveyard without tombstones for tens of thousands of nameless souls. When Germany failed to defeat Britain in the air during the Battle of Britain, they turned to a quieter, yet deadlier strategy, severing supply lines. And they chose the very heart of allied logistics, the Atlantic Ocean, to wage this war. By sinking cargo ships filled with food, fuel, and weapons traveling from the US to Europe, Germany hoped to strangle Britain's lifeline and paralyze the entire Allied war machine. To Hitler and his admirals, if the Atlantic became a dead zone, Britain would soon fall. At the center of this strategy was the U-boat, a weapon born in World War I, but brought to devastating perfection in World War II. These weren't glorious warships with tall sails or floating fortresses bristling with guns. The U-boat was shadow and silence, a steel serpent slithering beneath the waves, waiting, watching, and striking. The wolf pack tactic was the pinnacle of U-boat warfare, both coordinated and ruthless. The submarines never hunted alone. They were spread across the Atlantic in search lines. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it wouldn't attack immediately. It would signal headquarters. And then, other U-boat silent predators from multiple directions would converge, tightening a deadly circle around the prey. The attack would come at night, under the veil of darkness, when the sea lay still and unsuspecting. There would be no warning, no lights, only the terrible flash of torpedoes, the screech of breaking hulls, the rush of water into engine rooms, and the cries of men drowning in silence. The first to suffer were the men who didn't wear uniforms, the merchant sailors. They had no weapons to fight back, no air cover, no advanced tools to detect the lurking submarines. Many left port never to return. There were no headlines about their deaths, no grand funerals. They vanished into the sea, as if they had never existed. From 1940 to 1942, losses in the Atlantic peaked. In some months, nearly 800,000 tons of shipping were destroyed, hundreds of ships gone. It wasn't just a loss of goods, it was a crushing blow to morale. Ports in Britain faced food shortages. Reinforcement convoys failed to reach critical fronts, collapse felt inevitable. The British called this time Germany's happy time, but for them, it was the Black Pit, a stretch of ocean where there was no light, no rescue, only silent death. But history never flows in only one direction. The deeper the despair, the fiercer the resistance. In response to the U-boat threat, the Allies reorganized their shipping strategy. No longer would ships sail alone. They were grouped into convoys, each protected by escort warships. On the surface, destroyers, corvettes, and frigates formed a shield. In the air, long-range patrol aircraft flew watchful circles. Beneath the waves, sonar and radar scanned for the slightest movement. And when a U-boat dared to surface, it met fierce retaliation. New weapons, like the Hedgehog and Squid, allowed the Allies to strike accurately and at greater distances, forcing the hunters to become the hunted. The battle in the Atlantic was no longer a silent slaughter. It became a duel of wits, a race of technology, a contest of sheer will. Men developed fake radio signals to trick the wolf packs. They invented ways to bait submarines. And perhaps most importantly, they never stopped building ships. American Liberty ships rolled out in waves, each a symbol of resilience. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just the clash between ships and submarines. It was a fight for survival, one fought with radar and torpedoes, but also with sweat, hope, and grit. Some died without a trace, but some lived to tell of how they overcame the terror of the dark, defied the fury of the sea, and reclaimed every mile of ocean with courage. Today, when you stand at a quiet dock, it's hard to imagine that this was once the gateway to death. That once, men stepped aboard ships not knowing if they'd return. That beneath the waves of the Atlantic, an invisible war raged, a war not shown in films or taught in every class, but one that decided whether freedom had a fighting chance. The U-boats of Germany once cast a long shadow across the sea, but from that very darkness, the light of resistance, unity, and life emerged like a lighthouse that never fades. The Atlantic, in the end, did not become freedom's tomb. It became the place where freedom was kept alive, one convoy, one sailor, one breath at a time. If the Atlantic Ocean was the lifeline between Europe and America, then the Pacific in the early stages of World War II was a vast chessboard where Japan carefully, ruthlessly, and coldly placed its pieces. Amid the endless blue waves and scattered archipelagos, the Japanese Empire drew a wide maritime web of control, not only through warships, but through strategy, occupation, and the disruption of enemy supply lines. The war in the Pacific was not a head-on clash between two great fleets, but a continuous campaign stretched over thousands of nautical miles, where every island, every strait, and every coral reef could become a turning point of life or death. And throughout 1942, the one who held absolute advantage over this chessboard was Imperial Japan. Following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan did not pause. Instead, it launched a series of lightning campaigns capturing the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, and advancing as far as the edges of Australia's northern coast. Within a few months, Japan had seized control of an immense stretch of territory spanning from the Kuril Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, from the coast of China to the heart of the Central Pacific. But more important than the islands themselves were the routes between them. Japan did not merely conquer islands, they claimed the seas that connected them. These were the invisible highways over which all merchant convoys and military logistics flowed. Japan laid mines, deployed submarines, and built forward operating bases to construct a perimeter fortress, a defensive arc that cut across Allied supply lines and blocked access to strategic zones. Through a strategy of forward defense, Japan established major bases in Rabaul, Truk, Palau, and other key islands. These outposts allowed their warships to refuel, regroup, and strike far-reaching targets. Any Allied transport convoy daring to cross into these zones faced bombers launched from carriers, submarines lurking below, and fast-strike naval task forces. Any effort to resupply the Philippines, Southeast Asia, or Australia was a high-risk gamble, if not outright suicide, without long-range protection. Japan was not just attacking, they had created their own efficient logistical network. They organized long-distance supply routes from the Japanese mainland to the farthest outposts, transporting oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber and minerals from Southeast Asia, and troops across theaters of war. Japan's merchant fleet was one of the largest in Asia at the time, not just carrying goods, but ferrying the weight of imperial ambition across the water. Throughout 1942, the Pacific became a dangerous domain where U.S. ships dared not move freely. The American military transport network, without adequate naval escort, could barely reach beyond the international date line. Even American submarines, early in the war, struggled with mechanical problems and ineffective tactics, unable to significantly disrupt Japan's shipping routes during this critical period. Against this backdrop, battles like Midway and Guadalcanal emerged as strategic pivots, not just as naval showdowns, but as calculated efforts to reclaim the sea lanes. At Midway, the U.S. Navy broke Japan's momentum and seized the initiative at sea. At Guadalcanal, American forces fought for a small island with outsized strategic value. It served as a gateway to cut Japan's maritime corridor between Rabaul and the Solomon Islands. It's undeniable that throughout the first year of the Pacific War, Japan was the ocean's dominant power. They controlled the waters, dictated the routes, and forced the Allies into a reactive posture. Yet from this height of dominance, Japan's critical flaws soon became visible. They lacked logistical depth. Their rapid expansion, their overreach across isolated island chains, and their dependence on long and vulnerable supply lines made them susceptible to concentrated Allied counterattacks, especially from American submarines in later years. The Pacific War was not only about fortresses and fleets, it was about oil drums, sacks of rice, and control over every nautical mile. When Japan ruled the seas, their empire thrived. But as each shipping lane was cut, each outpost isolated, the dream of maritime supremacy faded like a bubble bursting over the open sea. The Silent War didn't begin with gunfire, it began with wheels turning, ships sailing, and boxes moving quietly across the globe. From the pivotal year of 1942 to the haunted waters of the Atlantic, and the vast empire Japan carved across the Pacific, we've seen that no army marches forward unless someone fuels the road beneath them. But the story doesn't end here. In the next chapter, you'll hear from naval historian John Poshout, explore how logistics turned the tide of war, and discover why this silent war never truly ended. It simply evolved into the world we live in today. Join us in Clip 2, The Legacy of a War Unseen.